सब अल्लाह का करम है, फर्स्ट क्लास। बोल दिया 3 मिनट में हदीस की किताब शुरू कर देगा, वो शुरू कर देगा, फिर जैसे जैसे आएंगे और ये सब जितने आ रहे हैं ना, रात तो दूर से आ रहे हैं, I think so. So everybody else is from, not like a half an hour maximum because it is stretch it. हाँ, कल 8:40 पे शुरू किया था, तो अब 8:40 पे ही रखेंगे। तो इंशाल्लाह हदीस के साथ 8:40 5 मिनट, तो 8:45 पे फिर 9 बजे तक मौलाना बैठ गए, तो क्योंकि वीकडे है, मैं हसन भाई से ये कह रहा था, दूर से आप लोग आते हैं, जैसे बाप साहब आए हैं, दूर से आए, तो आप लोग और वो पहले आके बैठे थे, बताया सब आधे घंटे के रास्ते, आधा घंटा और लेस। यहाँ पे ग्राउंड वाला, यहाँ से 12-15 मिनट, वो बेचारे 4 घंटे की ड्राइव करें। सब तो आ गए हैं पढ़ने वाले, हसन भाई बोल दो लोगों को कि अंदर आ जाएं, अगर हैं कोई बाहर तो।
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد عن جابر بن عبد الله الأنصاري أنه قال عن فاطمة الزهراء عليه السلام بنت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله قال سمعت فاطمة أنها قالت دخل علي أبي رسول الله في بعض الأيام فقال السلام عليك يا فاطمة فقلت عليك السلام قال إني أجد في بدني ضعف فقلت له أعيذك بالله يا أبته من الضعف فقال يا فاطمة ائتيني بالكساء اليماني فغطيني به فأتيته بالكساء اليماني فغطيته به وسرت أنظر إليه وإذا وجهه يتلاله كأنه البدر في ليلة تمامه وكماله اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد فما كانت إلا ساعة وإذا بولدي الحسن قد أقبل وقال السلام عليك يا أمه فقلت وعليك السلام يا خرتين وسمرة فؤادي فقال يا أمه إني أشم عندك رائحة طيبة كأنها رائحة جد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله فقلت نعم إن جدك تحت الكساء فأقبل الحسن نحو الكساء وقال السلام عليك يا جداه يا رسول الله أتأذن لي أن أدخل معك تحت الكساء فقال وعليك السلام يا ولدي ويا صاحب حوز قد أذنت لك فدخل معه تحت الكساء فما كانت إلا ساعة وإذا بولدي الحسين قد أقبل وقال السلام عليك يا أمه فقلت وعليك السلام يا ولدي ويا قرة وسمرة فؤادي فقال يا أمه إني أشم عندك رائحة طيبة كأنها رائحة جد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله فقلت نعم إن جدك واقعك تحت الكساء فدنا الحسين نحو الكساء وقال السلام عليك يا جداه يا رسول الله أتأذن لي أن أكون معكم تحت الكساء فقال وعليك السلام يا ولدي ويا شافي أمتي قد أذنت لك فدخل معهما تحت الكساء فأقبل عندك ذلك أبو الحسن علي بن أبي طالب وقال السلام عليك يا بنت رسول الله فقلت وعليك السلام يا أبا الحسن ويا أمير المؤمنين فقال يا فاطمة إني أشم عندك رائحة طيبة كأنها رائحة أخي وابن عمي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله فقلت نعم ها هو مع ولديك تحت الكساء فأقبل علي نحو الكساء وقال السلام عليك يا رسول الله أتأذن لي أن أكون معكم تحت الكساء قال له عليك السلام يا أخي ويا وسي وخليفتي وصاحب لواء قد أذنت لك ودخل علي تحت الكساء ثم أتيت نحو الكساء وقلت السلام عليك يا أبته يا رسول الله أتأذن لي أن أكون معكم تحت الكساء قال وعليك السلام يا بنتي ويا بزتي قد أذنت لك ودخلت تحت الكساء فلما اكتملنا جميعا تحت الكساء اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد أخذ برسول الله بطرف الكساء وأومي بيديه اليمنى إلى السماء وقال اللهم إن هؤلاء أهل بيتي وخاصتي وعامتي لحمهم لمي ودمهم دمي يؤلمني ما يؤلمهم ويحزنني ما يحزنهم أنا حرب لمن حاربهم وسلم لمن سالمهم وعدو لمن عاداهم ومحب لمن أحبهم إنهم مني وأنا منهم فاجعل صلواتك وبركاتك ورحمتك وغفرانك ورضوانك علي وعليهم وأذهب عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد فقال الله عز وجل يا ملائكتي ويا سكان السماوات إني ما خلقت سماعا مبنية ولا أرضا مدهية ولا قمرا منيرا ولا شمسا مزية ولا فلكا يدور ولا بحرا يجري ولا فلكا يسري إلا في محبة هؤلاء الخمسة الذين هم تحت الكساء. فقال الأمين جبرائيل: يا رب ومن تحت الكساء؟ فقال عز وجل: هم أهل بيت النبوة ومعدن الرسالة، هم فاطمة وأبوها وبالها وبنوها. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. فقال جبرائيل: يا رب أتأذن لي أن أهبط إلى الأرض ليكون معهم سادسة؟ فقال الله: نعم قد أذنت لك. فهبط الأمين جبرائيل وقال: السلام عليك يا رسول الله. العلي الآل يقرؤك السلام ويخصك بالتحية والإكرام ويقول لك: وعزتي وجلالي إني ما خلقت سماء مبنية ولا أرضا مدهية ولا قمرا منيرا ولا شمسا مزية ولا فلكا يدور ولا بحرا يجري ولا فلكا يسري إلا لأجلكم ومحبتكم، وقد أذن لي أن أدخل معكم، فهل تأذن لي يا رسول الله؟ فقال رسول الله: وعليك السلام يا أمين وهي الله، إنه نعم قد أذنت لك. فدخل جبرائيل معنا تحت الكساء فقال لي أبي: إن الله قد أوحى إليكم يقول: إنما يريد الله ليذهب عنكم الرجس أهل البيت ويطهركم تطهيرا. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. فقال علي لأبي: يا رسول الله أخبرني ما لجلوسنا هذا تحت الكساء من الفضل عند الله. فقال النبي: والذي بعثني بالحق نبيه واصطفاني بالرسالة نجيا ما ذكر خبرنا هذا في محفل من محافل أهل الأرض وفيه جم من شيتنا ومحبينا إلا ونزلت عليهم الرحمة وحفت بهم الملائكة واستغفرت لهم إلى أن يتفرقوا. فقال علي: إذن والله فزنا وفاز شيتنا ورب الكعبة. فقال النبي ثانية: يا علي، والذي بعثني بالحق نبيه واصطفاني بالرسالة نجيا ما ذكر خبرنا هذا في محفل من محافل أهل الأرض وفيه جم من شيتنا ومحبينا وفيهم محموم إلا وفرج الله همه ولا مغموم إلا وكشف الله غمه ولا طالب حاجة إلا وخذ الله حاجته. فقال علي: إذن والله فزنا وسئدنا وكذلك شيتنا فازوا وسئدوا في الدنيا والآخرة ورب الكعبة. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل ایک اور صلوات دے دیجیے. اللہم صلی علی محمد وعلی محمد. جو زیر کسا پروان چڑھے زینب ایسی ہستی ہے. جو زیر کسا پروان چڑھے زینب ایسی ہستی ہے. جو زین ابو جد بن کے رہے زینب ایسی ہستی ہے. زینب ایسی ہستی ہے. وہ جس نے بنائی اپنی جگہ اور بعد کسا معصوموں میں. وہ جس نے بنائی اپنی جگہ اور بعد کسا معصوموں میں اور بعد کسا معصوموں میں. خود فاطمہ جس پر ناز کرے زینب ایسی ہستی ہے. زینب ایسی ہستی ہے. شبیر سے باقی دین نبی شبیر سے باقی پیغمبر. شبیر سے باقی دین نبی شبیر سے باقی پیغمبر. شبیر سے باقی پیغمبر، شبیر رہیں زندہ جس سے، زینب ایسی ہستی ہے، زینب ایسی ہستی ہے۔ کنبے کی حفاظت بھی کرنا، دربار میں خطبے بھی دینا، کنبے کی حفاظت بھی کرنا، دربار میں خطبے بھی دینا، دربار میں خطبے بھی دینا، اس وسم میں بھی ماں سے آگے، زینب ایسی ہستی ہے، زینب ایسی ہستی ہے۔ خیموں کی حفاظت کے خاطر ٹوٹا ہوا ایک نیزہ لے کر، خیموں کی حفاظت کی خاطر ٹوٹا ہوا ایک نیزہ لے کر، ٹوٹا ہوا ایک نیزہ لے کر، جو شام غریباں پہرا دے، زینب ایسی ہستی ہے، زینب ایسی ہستی ہے۔ ڈھارس ہے امام دوراں کو، زینب سا نگہباں ساتھ میں ہے، ڈھارس ہے امام دوراں کو، زینب سا صاحباں ساتھ میں ہے، زینب سا نگہباں ساتھ میں ہے۔ عباس کبھی شبیر بنے، زینب ایسی ہستی ہے، زینب ایسی ہستی ہے۔ غم بھی نہ کرے پرسا بھی نہ لے، بے پردہ جسے امت نے کیا، اور اپنے تئیں رسوا بھی کیا، بے پردہ جسے امت نے کیا، اور اپنے تئیں رسوا بھی کیا، اور اپنے تئیں رسوا بھی کیا۔ جو امتیوں کا پردہ رکھے، زینب ایسی ہستی ہے، زینب ایسی ہستی ہے۔ گو ہاتھ پسے گردن ہو بندھے، اور کہنے کو قیدی ہو پھر بھی، گو ہاتھ پسے گردن ہو بندھے، اور کہنے کو قیدی ہو پھر بھی، اور کہنے کو قیدی ہو پھر بھی، جو گرتے ہوں کو سہارا دے، زینب ایسی ہستی ہے، زینب ایسی ہستی ہے۔ مختار ہے وہ مجبور نہیں، چاہے تو بدل دے پل بھر میں، مختار ہے وہ مجبور نہیں، چاہے تو بدل دے پل بھر میں، چاہے تو بدل دے پل بھر میں۔ حالات جو صفت جعفر کے، زینب ایسی ہستی ہے، حالات جو صفت جعفر کے، زینب ایسی ہستی ہے، زینب ایسی ہستی ہے۔
ور محمد و آل محمد صلوات۔
اللہم صلی علی محمد و آل محمد۔
ایک بار اور صلوات پڑھیے۔
اللہم صلی علی محمد و آل محمد۔
ماں کیا گوش میں وہ جام پیا ہے میں نے ماں کیا گوش میں وہ جام پیا ہے میں نے اور لب کھلے تو علی نام لیا ہے میں نے اور ملی کو جنبش جو میرے ہاتھوں کو اور ملی کو جنبش جو میرے ہاتھوں کو گود میں ماتم شبیر کیا ہے میں نے ماں کیا گوش میں پر محمد وآل محمد صلوات
اللہم صلی علی محمد وآل
عبد و معبود کے رشتے کو بنانے والے عبد و معبود کے رشتے کو بنانے والے اور جادہ حق سے قدم کو نہ ہٹانے والے اور سر کٹا کر تبلیغ کو چھوڑا شے نے، سر کٹا کر بنا تبلیغ کو چھوڑا شے نے، ایسے ہوتے ہیں محمد کے گھرانے، والے عبد و معبود کے۔ ایک اور صلوات پڑھے علی محمد وعلی
اللہم صلی علی محمد۔
خلد میں سوغات یہ اہل عزا لے جائیں گے، خلد میں سوغات یہ اہل عزا لے جائیں گے، اور کربلا کی خاک تھوڑی سی اٹھا لے جائیں گے، کربلا کی خاک تھوڑی سی اٹھا لے جائیں گے، خلد میں سوغات یہ اہل عزا لے جائیں گے، اور گمرہی کا غم نہیں میدان محشر میں ہمیں، گمرہی کا غم نہیں میدان محشر میں ہمیں، اور مانگ کر زہرا سے جنت کا پتہ لے جائیں گے، مانگ کر زہرا سے جنت کا پتہ لے جائیں گے، خلد میں سوغات یہ اہل عزا لے جائیں گے، اور ہم قیامت میں کریں گے نظر اشکوں کے گوہر، ہم قیامت میں کریں گے نظر اشکوں کے گوہر، اور جو اسے بدعت سمجھتے ہیں وہ کیا لے جائیں گے، خلد میں سوغات یہ اہل عزا لے جائیں گے، وہ جائیں گے جنت میں سیدھے ہم غلامان حسین، جائیں گے جنت میں سیدھے ہم غلامان حسین، اور دشمن آل نبی دوزخ میں ڈالے جائیں گے، خلد میں سوغات یہ اہل عزا لے جائیں گے، اور جو بھی ماتم کرنے آئے ہیں یہاں شبیر کا، جو بھی ماتم کرنے آئے ہیں یہاں شبیر کا، اور احمد و زہرا و حیدر در کی دعا لے جائیں گے، اور احمد و زہرا و حیدر کی دعا لے جائیں گے، اور آخرت کے راستے کا ہم کو کوئی ڈر نہیں، آخرت کے راستے کا ہم کو کوئی ڈر نہیں، اور تھام کر ہاتھوں کو خود مشکل کشا لے جائیں گے، اور تھام کر ہاتھوں کو خود مشکل کشا لے جائیں گے، خلد میں سوغات یہ اہل عزا لے جائیں گے، اور قبر میں خاک شفا ہر درد و غم کا ہے علاج، قبر میں خاک شفا ہر درد و غم کا ہے، اور چھوڑ دیں گے ہر دوا یہ دوا لے جائیں گے، خلد میں سوغات یہ اہل عزا لے جائیں گے، اور کیا خبر تھی حر کی قسمت اس قدر بیدار ہے، کیا خبر تھی حر کی قسمت اس قدر بیدار ہے، اور مر کے رومال جناب سیدہ لے جائیں گے، اور مر کے رومال جناب سیدہ لے جائیں گے، اور کانپ اٹھے گا لاشائے عباس دریا پر ضرور، کانپ اٹھے گا لاشائے عباس دریا پر ضرور، اور چھین کر ظالم جو زینب سے ردا لے جائیں گے، خلد میں سوغات یہ اہل عزا لے جائیں گے، اور سید سجاد کا کیا حال ہوگا اس گھڑی، سید سجاد کا کیا حال ہوگا اس گھڑی، اور ہائے جب بچی کے گوہر اشکیا لے جائیں گے، خلد میں سوغات یہ اہل عزا لے جائیں گے، اور کربلا کی خاک تھوڑی سی اٹھا لے جائیں گے، خلد میں سوغات یہ۔ سورہ فاتحہ۔ ایک اور صلوات پڑھی علی محمد وعلی محمد۔
صلی اللہ محمد وعلی محمد۔
جب گل ہوا چراغ حرم قید شام میں، جب گل ہوا چراغ حرم قید شام میں، یعنی سکینہ مر گئی یاد امام میں، اور دیکھے ستم یزید کے دربار عام، شیخ سلام کو گئے دارالسلام میں، شیخ و سلام کو گئے دارالسلام، اور دنیا میں داد رس نہ ملا داد خواہ کو، جا کے نشان تماچے کے دکھلائے شاہ، جا کے نشان تماچوں کے دکھلائے شاہ، اور غل پڑ گیا حسین کی عاشق نے کی بانوں نے نبض دیکھی تو پایا نہ دمز، اور چلائی صد کے جاؤں مجھے دے گئے اپنی کہے نہ میری سنی، ہائے کیا کیا اپنی کہے نہ میری سنی، ہائے کیا کیا، اور اصغر کو کچھ پیام بھی میں نے دیا، تم چل بسی اور اماں نے رخصت کیا نہیں، تم چل بسی اور اماں نے رخصت کیا نہیں، تم چل بسی اور اماں نے رخصت
کیا نہیں،
اور اصغر کی بھولی باتیں سناؤ نثار، ماں اکبر کا ذکر کر کے رلاؤ نثار، اور سیلی کا نیل ماں کو دکھاؤ نثار، بابا کو جا کے در پہ بلاؤ نثار، بابا کو جا کے در پہ بلاؤ نثار، اور ماتم کے غلغلے ہیں نہ رونے کے جوش، بی بی جو اب خاموش ہیں تو سب خاموش، بی بی جو اب خاموش ہیں تو سب خاموش، اور منہ ڈھانپنے کا وقت ہے پچھلا پہر ہوا، بابا کو تیرے روتی ہوں اٹھ ساتھ دے میرا، اور کرتے سے منہ کو ڈھانپ کے پہلو میں بیٹھ، اماں کی بیٹی اماں کو آواز تو سن، اماں کی بیٹی اماں کو آواز تو سن، اور ماتم سرا یہ گھر تھا تیرے بین کرنے، زندان سونا ہو گیا بی بی کے مرنے، زندان سونا ہو گیا بی بی کے مرنے، اور یہاں کس کے پاس رہتے شہ کربلا، بی بی کے ناز اٹھانے کی خاطر چچا، اور نادار ماں ہے پانی نہیں اور غذا، پر اب کفن کے واسطے ہے حیردان، پر اب کفن کے واسطے ہے حیردان، اور اماں کے پاس رہنے کی ایذا اٹھا چکی، بی بی تماچے کھا چکی گردن بندھا چکی، بی بی تماچے کھا چکی گردن بندھا چکی، بی بی تماچے کھا چکی گردن بندھا چکی، اور اماں کی پیاری بابا کی پیاری زبان کو شربت میں لائی میری پیاری دہاں کو کھول، اور ماں رو رہی ہے دیدہ گوہر فشاں کو، میں ماں بندھے گلے سے نہ جاری اس ماں کو، میں ماں بندھے گلے سے نہ جاری اس ماں کو، اور دادی کڑیں گی بی بی کی زلفیں سوار، لو اٹھو یہ फटा हुआ कुर्ता उतार दूं, लो उठो ये फटा हुआ कुर्ता उतार दूं, जब गुल हुआ चरागे।
Brothers and sisters, before I invite Maulana on a member, there are a couple of announcements. One is the Hadith-e Qissa will start 8:30 sharp. Maulana will be on the member by 9 o'clock. If we give Maulana member 9:15 or 9:30, still he will be down by 10. So he will not extend his speech because we are giving him member late. So I request everybody to please sharply be here by 8:30. So Marsiya Khani will be done and Hadith-e Qissa will be completed. The other thing is, day before yesterday, we found a small amount of money in the lobby. Anybody needed it or ask me if how much the amount, they can collect from me. Now, Maulana Sheikh Bilal Hussain is a resident alim in Sijni, which is new name is Al-Mahdi, old name is Hussaini Madrasa, New York. And he's a resident alim there. We welcome him to give a khitab to these audience for next 5 days till we suffer. Thank you. I invite Maulana to be on a member, please.
Inshallah, before we begin, there's a request for Fatiha for tonight's sponsors, for the marhameen of the families of Mr. and Dr. Hussain Naqvi and family, Mr. and Mrs. Muhib Abbas and family, Mr. and Mrs. Samir Sheikh and family, Mrs. Kahkashan Athar and family. Rahimallah ma yakra Surat al-Fatiha. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. الحمد لله رب العالمين، ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين، واللعنة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الحكيم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وإذا أذن ربكم لئن شكرتم لأزيدنكم ولئن كفرتم إن عذابي لشديد. آمنا بالله، صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات على محمد وعلى محمد. Your second salawat for love of Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And your louder salawat for ta'jeel faraj sahib al-asr wa zaman. There's no point in me asking how much time I have, I know. Now, with the time that we have, inshallah, every night our discussion is broken into two parts. The first is a discussion around some ahkam and rules and laws of fiqh, khususan as we talk about Arba'een and the first visitation of the grave of Aba Abdullah, pertaining to the issues of the grave and the burial of mu'mineen. And the second half of our discussion across these next 5 nights is a discussion pertaining to some of the explanations that Allah has given us about nations and the consequences of the actions that these nations and people took in the Quran. Within the Quran are many parables that are drawn. Allah tells us that I have drawn these parables for you to take lesson. Now, some of them are very famous and very well known to us, and we're very familiar with them. And there are others that in contemporary times demand our attention, but we haven't given them the proper focus that they deserve. Sometimes we wonder and we say, a religion that came 1400 years ago, what is its relevance to us today? How does it pertain to us today? Well, part of the conversation is we haven't looked at all of the lessons and the details to see how Allah has prepared and given us explanations to be cautious and conscious of the environment that we live in. So our discussion, inshallah, across these 5 nights will be the various communities and people and companions that Allah has mentioned in the Quran. What is their story and how does it pertain to us in our lives today? So with that, inshallah, we'll begin our discussion with the first part of our conversation. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. When it comes to the ahkam of the burial process, which is one of the obligations that we have, this is an important discussion to have and to understand in detail. Why? Because many of the things that we perform in the process of burial seem to be almost ritualistic to the extent where we don't understand why do we do the things that we do. Without having a conversation about the ahkam of burial and understanding the rules and processes behind the reason why we do what we do, our children will lose this heritage and understanding, and it is we who will suffer the consequences, that there will be no one there to ensure that our rights are fulfilled correctly. As such, the precursor and the introduction to this topic across the next 5 days that I will give you today is the importance of what happens on the day that someone is buried. That on the day that someone is buried, nothing that we do is for the living. Now let me explain what I mean by that statement. Okay, I have to be careful here, huh? There's a boundary. While it's true that when we go to the process of burying someone, and it's very mustahab for the men of the family and of the community to attend that burial, all of the actions that Islam prescribes to be done on the day of a burial are not with the significance of paying attention to fulfilling the emotional or spiritual needs of the living. Rather, the entire focal point is upon the deceased and the needs of the deceased. It's important to point this out because this idea and theory of what do we do when a person dies is in direct conflict with the culture that we live in. The American process of the funeral that exists in America is entirely focused on living, not the deceased. Let me explain what that means. When you take a look and see the funeral of someone who dies in America, first and foremost, the funeral is scheduled by the convenience of the living. In Islam, it's the other way around. We want to bury the person who's deceased immediately, no matter the inconvenience the living face in that situation. Secondly, the rituals that are associated with the American burial process are about the living bidding their final farewell to the one who has left us. Without getting into details, one of the biggest news media stories happening right now is about bidding farewell and the experience that people are having. Let's not get into the details of it. But the American culture, or the Western culture, is that the funeral process is for the living, that they get to say goodbye to the one that they've lost. They get to pay their respects. They get to see this person one more time. They get to live the values or enjoy this person one last time. And this entire process is associated that a person should feel a sense of completion when their relative has lost them. Islam doesn't believe in any of this. Islam says that the day that a person dies, the entire focus of every ritual that occurs, the primary focus, there's a secondary as well too, but the primary focus is the deceased and the needs of the deceased, not the living. The living, I have the rest of their living life to console them, to offer them condolences, to sit with them and spend time. But right now, the moment of burial, my focus is what is this person who has died needs from me? The significance of understanding this is that the difference in the view of how we view a dead person. In American culture, a dead person is someone that once they're dead, they're fana, they're gone. Which is why the discussion of what you do to the dead body is left to the discretion of people to decide. And what's cheaper and more convenient for me to do to this person? And those become the deciding factors of how I deal with the deceased. Why? He's gone, he's finished, he's no more. But in Islam, that's not the perspective we take. In Islam, we say that a human being is a composite of his ruh and his jism. And that jism, when it is separated from the ruh, the jism stops to exist, but the ruh continues its existence. So meaning that person who just died, while I can't interact with him anymore, he's not the fact that he is fana and gone, but rather he still is alive in existence. And now that he's transitioning from this phase of existence to a new phase of existence, this transition is difficult. I need to pay attention to this person's needs, and I need to help facilitate this transition for them as easily as possible. Which is why one of the ahkam of when we bring a deceased person to the graveyard is that we don't take him to the graveyard and straight into the grave and drop him in the ground and say Khuda Hafiz and leave. One of the first things that we do is that when we take a deceased person to the graveyard, we make what's called a 3 manazil, or 3 stops on the way to the grave. This is a mustahab action, but it's a very recommended action. And the purpose of that action is that to take someone who is living in amongst the living, amongst the people, living in this open faza, in this environment, and now to go place them into a closed, cramped place in the ground is a difficult transition. It's a frightening experience. So the first thing that we do is we don't bring them immediately to the grave and leave them at the grave. We stop along the way and give them a moment and process through this experience, then take them to the grave. One of the points that you'll notice of this process of burying someone is that we don't actually recommend, it's actually makruh to cry at the grave of a person. Why? Because at that moment, our focus needs to be the needs of the deceased. Now, one of the things that may happen sometimes, for example, the deceased may have been a father, may have been a mother, may have been a brother, someone who bore responsibility to a family, to people. In that moment, the deceased needs to focus on the fact that this new transition that I'm going through, this new place I'm going through, it has demands on me. It's not like life into this world. When we're born into this world, we come into this world and everybody else takes the responsibility for us. They raise us, they feed us, they clothe us, they do everything for us. But when we transition into the next phase of life, it is us who have the responsibility to be present, to represent and answer the questions, and to make the place that we belong in the next life. Therefore, at that moment, our goal is to give instruction and assistance to this person, not distract them by reminding them of the life that they left behind. Which is the reason why we say that to cry in that moment is a distraction for the deceased. Is a reminder of what they're leaving behind, not a focus of what they need to perform ahead. So here we have the responsibility to focus on this aspect of what this person's needs are. Amongst this process is the act of making the physical grave itself. One of the things that you'll notice that amongst Madhab-e-Ja'fari, when we make the grave where the right shoulder faces the direction of Qibla. And anytime you go to a graveyard of Madhab-e-Ja'fari, the right side of every deceased faces the direction of Qibla. Even when we go, the Maraqid al-Musharrafa, when you go for ziyarat of Ahlul Bayt, and may Allah next year give us tawfiq, that we are all in ziyarat of Arba'in. And all those who are there are here then, so that we trade off. Masjid is full too. You go to these haram, you can recognize and see the direction of Qibla and understand where and which way the head is situated by knowing that when we lay someone in the grave, their right shoulder will face the direction of Qibla, their right side faces Qibla. This brings another, you guys are okay? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. This is an important discussion. I wanted this to be brief, but there are some points to mention here which are actually significant. Sometimes when we talk about, for example, a Muslim is a Muslim, it's true, a Muslim is a Muslim. But there are some ahkam which are different amongst us that we have to pay attention to. When we talk about, for example, raising our children according to this madhab, that madhab, marrying from different madhab, there are consequences to some of these actions that bear weight, have significance. For example, the other 4 madhab don't face with the right shoulder facing Qibla. They face with the feet facing Qibla. Ahl Sunnah bury differently. For them, that's correct. For us, it's different. One of the things that's an important conversation, for example, if we marry into another madhab, is that what is the process that I want to be buried by? It shouldn't be a conversation that after we die, then our parents and our spouse are fighting over how this person will be buried. These are significant factors. That do you want to be buried by the way that you were raised? Or does someone else have control over that? It's an important point to pay attention to. But the other madhahib have a different opinion about this. And their graves are built differently for that reason. Our graves are built differently for this reason. It's an important point to pay attention when we talk about the practical differences. These are some of the practical differences. It doesn't mean that, for example, we have no relation with these people, and no. But it's a significant point to pay attention to. But don't look at all of the differences as superficial. No, there's practical things that will be different as well that need to be paid attention to, including the direction a grave is laid in. When we enter someone into the lahad is what it's called when the grave is made. Now there's a difference between how a traditional Islamic grave is made and the way a Western grave is made. And we'll point that out inshallah in tomorrow we'll continue our discussion from here. One of the descriptions of how an Islamic grave is made is that first we dig down and then we dig a shelf into the side. We never put the weight of the dirt on the body itself. In comparison, the Western system of burial that relies on the use of vaults and boxes places the box inside and then places the dirt immediately on top of it. These differences can be some of the ways that we see some of the things that are done differently here than the way they're done in Islamic countries. And I'll point that out in a moment. When we talk about the lahad that's made, it's a little, almost like a bed or a shelf that's made on the inside. We can dig straight down and then off to the side, so that the ground over the body is firm and that the ground that's unsettled is off to the side, not over the person who's deceased. And the significance will come tomorrow. This process now, because there's a shelf to lower a person into, you can't simply take a person and drop them into the ground, as is done in the Western culture. Western culture, and not just Western culture, even for example in Saudi Arabia, they have a fear of the grave. So actually the graves in Saudi Arabia are bigger than the hotel rooms sometimes, seriously. They dig a very big room and they put the person inside and then they put cement over the top and they close it and they leave. They never come back. Meaning people who have a fear of the grave, they present to the grave in such a way that they want to stay as far away from it as possible. For us, no. You can't simply lower the body into the grave because there's the shelf. That burying someone is actually a two-man process. It takes two people to bury someone. One to pass someone down, and two for the person to place them into the shelf or into the bed that's been made for them there. This process of two people is actually interesting because it's different from men and women. For women, the person that should place them into the grave is one of their mahram, meaning one of their family members, and the closer the relative, the better. For men, it's actually makruh that a man should be buried by his family members. Let me explain why. The difference is the priority of what's going on. Islam acknowledges that the burial of a relative and a family member is a very difficult thing. To take your loved one and place them in the ground leaves a mark on a person. Therefore, in the case of men, Islam said, let the community come forward, let the friends come forward, let the close companions of that family come forward and take this responsibility off of the family members so that they don't have to go through this experience of leaving their loved one in the ground. But when it comes to women, Islam gave it a different priority and said the hijab and the ihtaram of the woman is more significant than the difficulty of placing her in the ground, and gave priority that we should ensure that the people who are burying that woman are people who have the permissibility and who are mahram to her. And the more mahram they are, the closer the relationship, the better. That these are the rights and the responsibilities that Allah has placed in the differences of these genders. Each of the rules within Islam is conscious of the environment that it comes through and what is the consequence of that action. Shall I give you an example in another area that Islam changes the rules? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. La situation. The way of drinking a glass of water. Islam has actually prescribed us a technique for drinking water, that in the daytime, you should stand up when you drink water, and at night, sit when you drink water. When you stand up, if you take the water yourself, drink the water in 3 sips. Take the glass in your hand, 1, 2, 3, and finish the cup. This entire istihbab and recommendation changes if someone else hands you the cup. If I'm given the cup of water by a person who is now waiting for me or is waiting to serve others, the istihbab from drinking in 3 sips changes to its mustahab to drink in 1 sip. So that the person who is waiting is not waiting for me to process this, or the next person who is thirsty is not waiting for me, rather that I complete this process as quickly as possible. All of the Islamic laws that we talk about have a cognizance and awareness of who we are, and for us to be aware of our environment, to live our life according to Islam. Islam is not inconsiderate of humanity, rather it is extra considerate to pay attention to every situation. Inshallah, we'll continue our discussion around the ahkam of burial tomorrow. Today we've started a little bit late, we're a little short on time. Inshallah, we'll continue this discussion tomorrow. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The verse that we began our discussion with, the 7th verse of Surah Ibrahim, talks about when Nabi Musa was told, وَإِذْ أَذَّنَ رَبُّكُمْ لَإِنْ شَكَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُمْ وَلَإِنْ كَفَرْتُمْ إِنَّ عَذَابِي لَشَدِيدٌ. Allah makes a statement and He makes Nabi Musa announce, وَإِذْ أَذَّنَ رَبُّكُمْ. When your Lord told you, وَإِذْ تَعَذَّنَ, your Lord told you to go and announce to the Bani Israel that if you are thankful to me, to Allah, I will give you more and plenty. وَلَئِنْ كَفَرْتُمْ, and if you are ungrateful of the bounties that I give you, then certainly my chastisement and punishment will be severe. What's interesting about the language that Allah uses is that many times we think of the concept of kufr as disbelief. And kufr is confined to the statement, I disbelieve. I don't believe there is a God. But rather what we find is the Mufassirin look at this verse and others like it, that kufr and disbelief in Allah has phases. And one of the levels of disbelief is ungratefulness in Allah. That when I am ungrateful to Allah and I don't appreciate what Allah has given me, I don't acknowledge that Allah is the provider, I have entered into the process of not believing in the presence and reality that Allah exists. And that this is one of the earlier, lower phases of kufr, of not acknowledging the bounties of Allah. This aspect of not acknowledging the bounties and appreciating and being thankful to Allah for what He gives us, aside from it just being an aspect of kufr, it's not something that people naturally do. Because in Surah Saba, Allah makes another statement, وَقَلِيلٌ مِّنْ عِبَادِيَ الشَّكُورِ. And few from amongst those who worship Allah are thankful to Him. Never make the assumption that, well, I pray, I fast, therefore I am thankful and appreciative of what Allah gives me. No, fulfilling our wajibat, being a servant of Allah, knowing that Allah exists, is not thankfulness. That is the minimum requirement that we have to exist as human beings. Thankfulness is a phase above that, which Allah says that even from amongst those who worship me, وَقَلِيلٌ مِّنْ عِبَادِي. Now this ibadi that Allah uses, my servants, can be found in 2 meanings. One, to say that everyone who exists is Abdullah and a servant of Allah, and that few amongst all of Allah's creation worship Him. Or the other, more frightening meaning, that there are those amongst humanity who acknowledge that Allah has authority over them, and yet still they are not thankful to Allah for what He gives them in their lives. This discussion about being thankful to Allah and appreciative of what Allah gives us, Allah has actually drawn parables for us in the Quran to teach us the importance and the consequence of not being thankful. And it becomes an interesting conversation for us to take a look at, which we will in Surah Nahl, verse number 112. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. In this example, the 16th chapter, the 112th verse, Allah gives us a parable and example He says, وَضَرَبَ اللَّهُ مَثَلًا قَرْيَةً كَانَ آمِنَةً مُطْمَئِنَّةً يَأْتِهَا رِزْقُهَا رَغْدًا مِّن كُلِّ مَكَانٍ. Allah begins the verse by telling you that I'm going to give you an example now. And he says, I have drawn a parable for you of a city that existed, that had security and peace. مُطْمَئِنَّةً آمِنَةً مُطْمَئِنَّةً. It had peace and security. يَأْتِهَا رِزْقَهَا رَغْدًا مِّن كُلِّ مَكَانٍ. And this city had received its rizq and resources from every place, and any bounty that you desired was present in this location. فَكَفَرَتْ بِأَنْعَمِ اللَّهِ فَأَذَاقَهَا اللَّهُ لِبَاسَ الْجُوعِ وَالْخَوْفِ بِمَا كَانُوا يَصْنَعُونَ. But they disbelieved, they were ungrateful to Allah. Therefore Allah made them taste of hunger and fear, and covered it in a garment from every side because of the mistake and the evil that the people used to commit. Now some of the Mufassirin give the example of saying that the verse within itself is a parable. To imagine a city where you could find everything, but the people were ungrateful, and as a consequence of their being ungrateful, Allah gave them difficulties and trials. But some of the Mufassirin point to an example of a group from the Bani Israel. And the explanation is to say that a group from the Bani Israel had migrated to a lake known as Nahr Tharthar. Nahr Tharthar is actually known in English as the Hazar Lake. At the south of Turkey is a series of mountains. And these mountains, the snow from them and the rains from them melts and leads into a lake. And this lake, Nahr Tharthar or Hazar Lake, is actually the origin and the start of the Tigris River. Now the Tigris River, imagine, is one of the two rivers that made Iraq the land of the black sand. In all of Arabia, this location, Iraq, was known as the land of the black sand, that here anything and everything could grow. We say the cradle of civilization existed between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers because it was known as the Fertile Crescent. That this was the place where land was in the most beneficial opportunity to grow and to benefit the people. The origin of that river, the Tigris River, this Hazar Lake or Nahr Tharthar, a group of the Bani Israel had come and settled in this location. And this location was where Allah describes Aminatan Mutma'innatan, that it was a perfect location that was perfectly safe and secure, and that rizq would come to these people from wherever was around them. And the description of this was to say that the same river that made all of Iraq fertile, its origination in Tharthar was such a plentiful and good water that anything that these people would plant would grow in abundance. They could grow anything here. And not only would it would grow in plenty, where the description comes to say that the people of Tharthar, the people of this lake, would plant wheat, and they would have so much wheat that they didn't know what to do with it. They would plant anything and it would grow in plenty, that they never had a shortfall of food, and Allah gave them every comfort and convenience. Now, as a consequence of them having plenty of wheat, they would make plenty and tons of bread, that there was never a shortage of bread in this land. But there was a consequence to their being ungrateful to the mercy and bounty that Allah had given to them. And this is where the process where Allah mentions that they disbelieved. So therefore difficulty came upon them. The description says, the Mufassirin explain that these people of Tharthar, they had so much bread that they decided it would make a good diaper. Ajallakumullah. Let me explain. Because they were not foolish people. Obviously, they had the ability to cultivate the land to make lots and plenty. But when they had excess, they came to the conclusion, they said, the things that we use for our own sanity and cleanliness are too harsh and harmful for our children. Our children are a great bounty that we possess. So we need to use the best that we possess for them. I said, bread, we have so much of it. So they started to use bread as the concept of a diaper that was used to clean their children. And it goes further. Mufassirin give 3 examples. They say, 1, that they used this to clean their children. 2, that they took this bread and they cleaned their children and they would make mountains of soiled bread. And the 3rd, that they had so much bread that aside from making mountains of soiled bread, they would even make idols out of the bread. Because they had so much of it, nobody needed it, it was in excess. So they would go through this process of wasting this bread in all of the different ways that they could. Now Allah continues the discussion around these people. In verse number 113, He says, وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُمْ رُسُولٌ مِّنْهُمْ فَكَذَّبُوهُ فَأَخَذَهُمُ الْعَذَابَ وَهُمْ ظَالِمُونَ. It explains and it says, Allah says that a messenger came to them from amongst themselves. What's described is that we know it was a tribe of Bani Israel because the Bani Israel would visit each other's towns because they were all of relatives. So the Bani Israel from other tribes and locations would come and visit the place of Tharthar to visit their relatives. And it so happened that a pious member of the Bani Israel came to these people of Tharthar, and when he saw a woman clean her child's backside with bread, ajallakumullah, and throw it into a pile, he started to chide them. He started to warn them. And he said, how dare you? Don't you appreciate the bounty that Allah has given you, the mercy has provided you? How could you be so careless with this bounty? And famously, this woman replies and she says, you threaten us? We are Ahle Tharthar. We are the people of this water and this lake that grows anything and everything. What do you think is going to happen to us? We'll become hungry? No. We know better what we're doing than you do. Don't try and chide us. So Allah replies and He says, فَكَذَّبُوهُ. They belied Him. They refused to listen to advice. فَأَخَذَهُمُ الْعَذَابُ وَهُمْ ظَالِمُونَ. So they were overcome by the punishment of Allah when they themselves were the oppressors. Now this question of adhab here, we have a couple of minutes, everybody's okay? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. This adhab, was it a punishment? I'll answer the question. If it was a punishment, what's the point of the Day of Judgment? If it wasn't a punishment, then what was it? There's a few points that we look at in these verses that tell us that this wasn't a punishment. One, in verse number 112, Allah says, لِبَاسَ الْجُوءِ وَالْخَوْفِ بِمَا كَانُوا يَصْنَعُونَ. That they were overcome by fear and hunger because of what they used to do. بِمَا كَانَ يَصْنَعُونَ. That what they presented, this was the consequence of their actions. That what they saw was the consequence of their actions. And the reason that we believe it's not a punishment is, what's the point of the Day of Judgment if you're going to get punished in this world? One of the interesting points, for example, when we see a difficulty that befalls us in this life, we turn around and immediately look, why am I being punished? Why is Allah punishing me? Allah is not punishing you. It's the consequence of the decisions you make in your life that you have to face. The punishment is something separate that will come later. Now the question in this situation is, what was the action that they performed that the consequence was that they went through hunger? One aspect very easily could be is how we're learning today of how interrelated our biome is. That, for example, one change, one missing element here causes consequence in another location. That the same way that these people were abusing the resources that they possessed, they weren't utilizing the resources, they were abusing them. And as a consequence, Allah brought them into hunger and fear. How did Allah bring them into hunger and fear? Allah says that that lake that they relied on dried up. And it dried up in such a way that it dried up and the rain would refuse to fall on these people anymore. Now, what are the things that can cause, for example, when we look scientifically, we can understand what causes a drought today. We understand that what these problems are that bring about the consequences of missing water in the land. Those people at that time who are missing this knowledge saw it only as Allah is punishing us. But we see that Allah is saying, no, punishment is for akhirah. This is the consequence of dunya that you're facing, that you made bad choices with the resources you have. Now deal with the consequences of those actions. We see the same thing today when we talk about global warming, when we talk about filth in the seas, when we talk about all of the other issues that are happening in this world. Is it a punishment from Allah? Had it been a punishment, why do we need the Day of Judgment? The fact that we see consequence, these are the consequences, which is why Allah says very clearly, بِمَا يَصْنَعُونَ, that what they did brought about these actions upon them. It's very important to pay attention to this point. So what happens when this lake dries up? We have a few minutes. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now the people wind up desperate. Food doesn't grow. Food doesn't grow anymore. But they have a store of food. They have a lot of food saved up. The problem is that it's covered, ajallakumullah, in filth. The people wound up in such dire straits that the only food that they had left was the mountains of food that they had covered in the filth of their own children. They wound up in such a state of hunger that they had no choice, not only that they had to go and eat that bread, but that they were fighting over that bread. When Allah says, libas al-ju'i wal-khawf, they were hungry and they were fearful. Why? Because of the fighting. Eventually they had to go to the extent that they established judges who would sit with a scale that each family would only get a certain portion of the soiled bread because there was not enough for everyone. This was the consequence of their actions that they had chosen, that now these same people who had so much that they abused it, that now all of a sudden they have nothing, and that what they threw away, they have to go back and take that and use that as food, no matter the filth that it contained. When we look at, for example, and Allah warns us, for example, in verse number 114, فَكُلُوا مِمَّا رَزَقَكُمُ اللَّهُ حَلَالًا طَيِّبًا وَاشْكُرُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ إِن كُنتُمْ إِيَّاهُ تَعْبُدُونَ. In verse 114, Allah completes the story and He gives the warning to us. He says, then go out and eat the food that Allah has given you, the lawful and good things, and be grateful for the favors of Allah. Thank Allah for the bounties that He gives you. Don't be ungrateful. And it is إِيَّاهُ يَعْبُدُونَ. It is ta'budun. It is Allah who you have the responsibility to serve. Now there's a few important points. One is the aspect of knowing the concept of a God-centric life, not to be lost in the aspect if we have plenty, then what do we need Allah for? Two, the consequences and the abuse of the behavior that we have. Allah put Adam and Ibn Adam on this earth and said, the earth is yours. Use it how you want. But Allah gave us the instruction, use it, don't abuse it. That there are consequences when we abuse the resources that we have present within us. And that the situation that Allah should so choose to punish us for our abuse would be such that it would be something that's such a disgrace that when Allah draws a parable, one who listens to it finds it to be disturbing. This is the parable that we're reading, to understand and see that how people behaved and what was the consequence of their action. And on an individual level, to acknowledge and understand the trials that I face in life, more often than not, are a consequence of the decisions that I'm making. The punishment of Allah and the reward of Allah He has reserved for akhirah. So when I see a difficulty befall me, did I bring the difficulty upon myself? Now understand, when we see this thought process, now we look at the advice of Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. When he gives a letter after the battle of Siffin to his children, and he says, recognize that some lessons you can teach your children and they'll listen to you, and some lessons they will have to learn on their own. Apply that to yourselves. That if I listen to one who has gone through experiences before, I can learn the consequences of my decisions and save myself from certain trials that Allah would put me through. But if I refuse to listen to the advice and counsel, and I don't look for the advice and counsel of those who are more knowledgeable, then I am likely to face the consequences of my decisions alone and on my own. Al-Mu'mineen is giving us instruction here to follow and be careful of the decisions that we make. In these 5 nights, we'll mention some of the masa'ib of Ahl Haram and mention some of the difficulties that they had to face leading up to the event of Arba'in. And one of the most difficult events upon Ahl Haram was that in Sham, not 1 but 2 graves were made. The first of these graves that was made, understand how I said to you that it takes 2 people to lower someone into the grave. Have you ever asked yourself that in the prison of Sham, there is the grave that is made there, but there was only 1 mahram who was present at that time to bury that child. There was only 1 man who was there that how did our Imam Zainul Abidin lower his sister into this grave? What was that process for him? In Tariq, there are only two people you will find who are alone and in such difficulty that no one was there to help them. One is this Sayyid al-Sajideen in Sham, and the other is Ali ibn Abi Talib in Medina. In Medina, in the middle of the night, as he fulfilled the wasi of Sayyida Zahra, and she said, bury me alone in the middle of the night. Oh Ali, غسلني, حنتني, كفني, ودفني بالليل. Don't let anyone know where I am buried. Did you ever wonder to imagine that it takes two people to lower someone into the grave? Ali ibn Abi Talib in the darkness of the night took the daughter of Rasulullah to a secret grave that had been dug for him. When he sits by that grave, and there is the lahad in which the body needs to be lowered, who is the mahram to assist Ali in lowering Zahra, the daughter of Rasulullah? Oh Sayyida, you were alone, but what condition did you leave Ali in? Who was it there that would help Ali to lower the body of Sayyida Zahra? They say in this instance, we imagine that the loneliness and difficulty of Ali, there was no one to call for help, that it must have been the hands of Rasulullah that raised from the grave. Ali, return my amana to me. Imam Ali would have replied, Ya Rasulullah, I am embarrassed to see you in this condition. When you left her with me, her eye was not bruised, her ribs were not broken, her mohsin was not shaheed. Ya Rasulullah, don't blame me for what they have done to her. The other Imam Zainul Abidin in Sham, but his is even worse, because while Ali ibn Abi Talib's hands were open to take Fatima to Zahra, Ali ibn al-Hussain was in chains as he had to lower his sister. We imagine that in that moment, it would have been his father Hussain who raised his hands. Why? Because in Karbala, he called out, Sakina ilayya ilayya. That now in Sham, when this child has been hurt and injured and killed out of anger, it would be Abu Abdullah would call out, Zainul Abidin, return my Sakina to me. But how does the son answer his father? Baba, she did not have the bruises of the hands of Shimon on her face. Baba, her ears had not been ripped and bloody from her earrings. Baba, forgive me, I did not have kafan for my sister. Baba, her wounds had healed with the cloth that she could see the burns on her body. This was one of the two graves made in Sham. Remember the other grave that my Imam had to make. All of the shuhada, their heads were not returned to Karbala. Only one head was returned to Karbala. Did you wonder at the Masa'ib of Zainul Abidin, that how did he bury the head of Abu Fadl? How did he look at the head of his brother Akbar? How did he bury the head of his brother Asghar? ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. Maatam and Hussain.
Ya Hussain, 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 Ya Hussain.
Ya Abbas, Ya Abbas, Ya Abbas, Ya Abbas. जहाँ भी पानियों मुझको आलम की बात चली, अली के लाल के कदमों तेरे फुरात चली, वफा इश्क मोहब्बत की कायनात चली, دعائے فاطمہ زہرا بھی ساتھ ساتھ چلی، دعائے فاطمہ زہرا بھی ساتھ ساتھ چلی، علم کے دم سے ہے اب تک حیات پانی کی، جری کے جیت ہوئی اور مات پانی کی، جری تجیت ہوئی اور مات پانی کی۔ یا عباس یا عباس یا عباس یا عباس، وہ ایک مشق جو قصر سمیت کرنے کے لیے، لبوں پہ اپنے سمندر سمیت کرنے کے لیے، لبوں پہ اپنے سمندر سمیت کرنے کے لیے، تو بے سمے علی اصغر سمیت کرنے کے لیے، وہ ایک ضربش لشکر سمیت کرنے کے لیے، وہ ایک ضربش لشکر سمیت کرنے کے لیے، اگر نہ کہتی ہے آب حیات پانی کی، ہر ایک نگاہ سے گر جاتی ذات پانی کی، ہر ایک نگاہ سے گر جاتی ذات پانی کی۔ یا عباس یا عباس یا عباس یا عباس،
یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین ہائے یا حسین ہائے حسینہ ہائے حسینہ ہائے حسینہ ہائے حسینہ، زندہ سے رہا ہو گئے سادات، زندہ زندہ سے رہا ہو گئے سادات، زندہ سے اللہ یہ کیا ہو گئے سادات، اللہ یہ کیا ہو گئے سادات، خود کرب و بلا ہو گئے سادات، زندہ سے رہا یہ کیسی رہائی ہے کہ دل خوش نہیں ہوتا، یہ کیسی رہائی ہے کہ دل خوش نہیں ہوتا، کیا رہ گیا زندہ میں کہ ہر قیدی ہے روتا، کیا رہ گیا زندہ میں کہ ہر قیدی ہے روتا، کیا اپنی سکینہ سے جدا ہوتے ہیں سادات، اللہ میرے اللہ، سادات اے شامیوں اب چین سے آرام سے سونا، بے چین کرے گا نہ کسی بچی کا رونا، بے چین کرے گا نہ کسی بچی کا رونا، جو شب کو بکا کرتی تھی روئے گی کبھی نہ، اللہ میرے اللہ، زندہ زندہ زینب نے کہا قید میں ہے میرا خزانہ، زینب نے کہا قید میں ہے میرا خزانہ، اے عورتوں جب شام ڈھلے اس طرف آنا، اے عورتوں جب شام ڈھلے اس طرف آنا، تربت پہ سکینہ کی دیا ایک جلانا، اللہ میرے اللہ، زندہ سجاد نے زیور جو اسیری کے اتارے، جو اسیری کے سوکھے ہوئے سب زخم ہرے ہو گئے سارے، ہر سر دیکھ کے بابا کا تڑپ کر وہ پکارے اللہ میرے اللہ. زینب نے ردا پا کے کہا شکر خدا ہے یا شکر خدا ہے. عباس میرے بھائی مگر صدمہ بڑا ہے. سر ننگے ہمیں سارا جہاں دیکھ چکا ہے اللہ میرے اللہ. آخری زندہ سے رہا داد کلثوم جو ایک لفظ ابھی تک نہ تھی بولی جو ایک لفظ ابھی تک نہ تھی جس وقت رسن بازو سے سجاد نے کھولی جس وقت رسن بازو سے سجاد نے کھولی کہنے لگی کیا جائیں وطن خالی ہے جھولی اللہ میرے اللہ. زندہ سے زندہ سے رہا ہو گئے سادات. یا حسین 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 یا
توجہ زیارت. السلام علیکم یا ابا عبداللہ وعلی الرواح التي حلت بفنائک. علیک منی سلام اللہ ابدا ما بقیت بقی اللیل والنہار ولا جعله اللہ آخر لحظ منی لزیارتکم. السلام علی الحسین وعلی علی بن الحسین وعلی اولاد الحسین وعلی اصحاب الحسین جميعا ورحمۃ اللہ وبرکاتہ. السلام علیکم یا مولا وابن مولا. السلام علیکم یا غریب الغرباء سلطان ابو الحسن علی بن موسى الرضا. سیدی ارزقنا فی الدنیا زیارتک وفی الآخرت شفاعتک ورحمۃ اللہ وبرکاتہ. السلام علیکم یا صاحب الزمان. السلام علیکم یا خلیفۃ الرحمن. السلام علیکم یا شریک القرآن. السلام علیکم یا کعبۃ الایمان. السلام علیکم یا امامنا و امام الانس والجان. عجل اللہ تعالی فرجک وسهل اللہ تعالی مخرجک وظہورک ورحمۃ اللہ وبرکاتہ.
صلی